synthetic cannabinoids. So amphetamine analogs is an important group of drugs. Amphetamine itself is kind of the granddaddy of these, and it's been around a long time, since 1887. This is a form that was widely used in the middle of the last century, the Benzedrine inhaler. This was sold as a nasal decongestant, something that you might use like Afrin today. But people would either just use a whole bunch of these things, or they would break them open and aspirate the contents with a syringe. If you read any Jack Kerouac and read about them going to get some bennies, these are the Benzedrine inhalers that they were talking about. But it wasn't just the beatniks that were using these. This is a Pan Am in-flight menu from around that same time period, and you can see by the service items, Benzedrine inhalers. It wasn't just the people in the back of the plane either. Amphetamines have been widely used as performance enhancers for military aviation. Going back to World War II, actually all sides used it in World War II. Americans, Japanese, and Germans notably used amphetamines for their pilots to improve their reaction time. This is a meme that was kind of a joke, I guess, in poor taste from the beginning of the Afghanistan conflict, but if you remember, there was a friendly fire incident where American planes had fired on friendly Canadian troops, and at that time, our most advanced aircraft were being flown off of American soil. They weren't allowed to fly off of our forward bases, so they were going halfway around the world to do a bombing run in Afghanistan, and then they'd have to fly back to the US. And they were given amphetamines to keep them awake and sharp for those missions, and there were questions about whether that could have impaired their judgment. So amphetamines, people typically who are going to die of tachydyspnea, hyperthermia, ischemia complications. And this was out of order, but let me just talk about the basic mechanism of action of all of the amphetamines. So normally, all of your norepinephrine, and this is also true for serotonin and dopamine, amphetamines and amphetamine analogs affect all of those neurotransmitters to different degrees. So this is just an example, but you can replace all the noraddies with 5-HTs and Ds and it would be the same thing. So all of the neurotransmitters should be in the storage vesicle. There shouldn't normally be any in the cytoplasm because it gets broken down by monoamine oxidase or it gets packaged into the vesicle. And when an impulse comes down that neuron, that vesicle fuses with the cytoplasmic membrane, releases norepinephrine into the synapse where it binds to your postsynaptic receptor. Then at the end of that, it has to get taken back up by this reuptake carrier, and it's facilitated diffusion. It relies on the fact that there's no norepinephrine in the cytoplasm, and when you've released it into the synapse, there's a lot in the synapse. So it comes back up into the presynaptic neuron and either gets broken down or repackaged. Amphetamines look enough like our catecholamines that they get packaged, they get taken up by the same channels and get packaged into the storage vesicles, and they make it more permeable and leaky, and all of the neurotransmitter leaks out into the cytoplasm where it's normally not supposed to be. And what happens is then you have a concentration gradient going the other way, and what's normally your reuptake channel it turns into something that's putting a neurotransmitter out into the synapse. So these are basically indirect noradrenergic agonists as well as serotonin and dopamine. Same basic mechanism, you just replace the neurotransmitter. So all of your catecholinergic effects are epi. Your hallucinations and psychosis are going to be from serotonin effects and dopamine effects. So basic treatment of amphetamines address the things that are going to kill them. It's the agitation, the hyperthermia. Giving them benzodiazepines is the best way to address agitated delirium, as we talked about in the last lecture that I gave here. And hyperthermia is a big issue, rapid cooling. So in this time of year, we see a lot of patients who are dying of hyperthermia from agitated delirium. Getting them into an ice bath is the quickest way to bring that temperature down, and then just good supportive care. So that's amphetamine, and amphetamine is a phenylethylamine, so ring, carbon, carbon, nitrogen. And anything with ring, carbon, carbon, nitrogen is going to have amphetamine-like effects. So you can add a lot of things onto this basic backbone, and it's still going to act like an amphetamine. In general, if you add stuff onto the chain, it gets more noradrenergic. If you add stuff onto the ring, especially if you make a second ring, it starts to look like serotonin, and you get more serotonergic-like effects. So this book is PCAL, written by Alexander Shulgin, who's a synthetic chemist. It stands for phenylethylamines I have known and loved. And he synthesized a whole bunch of amphetamine analogs, wrote about his recipe, basically, in this book, and then he and his wife would try them by different routes and in different doses, and then he writes about his subjective experience, gave what now is called a trip report. So basically, kind of experimented on himself and his wife with a variety of these compounds. This book you can get on Amazon. It's pretty interesting. You can also read excerpts of it on arrowhead.org, which is a drug information website. So just to illustrate the point that I was talking about before, this is amphetamine. You can see ring, carbon, carbon, nitrogen. This is methamphetamine. Putting that extra methyl group on there makes it more noradrenergic. If you add a polar group here, it's going to make it even more so. So this is pseudoephedrine, something that we don't think of as an amphetamine. Mostly we think of it for its vasoconstrictor effects. And then MDMA, you make that second ring and it starts to look like serotonin. So MDMA, also known as Molly, is the prototypical designer drug. It's actually been around a long time, first synthesized around World War I, but rediscovered in the 70s initially by psychiatrists who were interested in its effects for psychotherapy. They would give it to patients, and one of the effects of MDMA is that it enhances emotional connectedness to others. We call it adaptogen effects. And the psychiatrists thought that that was great. They'd made breakthroughs in therapy, but then the patients really started to like it and started to use it outside that context, and it spread into the general community from there. And actually, the Designer Drug Act, also known as the Controlled Substance Enforcement Act of 1986, was passed specifically in response to the growing popularity of ecstasy. And what that act said is that it basically fast tracks new drugs to be scheduled by the DEA without new legislation each time. Because before you had to pass a new law to make each substance illegal, it gave the DEA the authority to schedule a drug without new legislation if it was structurally and functionally similar to an existing illegal drug. So MDMA is more serotonergic, less noradrenergic. This is MDMA, this is serotonin. You can see how it could fool your serotonergic reuptake channels into thinking that it's serotonin. This is the exact same mechanism as before, but the norad's are replaced by 5-HTs and it just turned 90 degrees. So MDMA tends to be sold in tablets, although it's bioavailable by any route. It tends to be these kind of colored tablets and either stamped or embossed with various consumer product logos. There's a million of them out there. If you can think of a consumer product, there's probably an ecstasy tab for it. One thing that's interesting is that what's sold as Molly or ecstasy is not always that drug. And so in this supposed ecstasy pill lineup, next to the Volcom is the Mitsubishi pill here, is a kind of notorious player from the 1990s that typically contained PMA or paramethoxyamphetamine, which was responsible for a lot of deaths. So you have to be really concerned, and there was a lot of harm reduction efforts that tried to address this by testing people's pills in clubs. So people could take a scraping of their pill in a club, it would be tested and then posted online on websites like Dance Safe about, the pill that was gotten in Houston in 2009, August, contained 40% MDMA, 10% diazepam, 50% inert, and just put it online so people would know what they were getting. Literally anything out there, there's probably an ecstasy pill for it. This is the Trump pill. This is one from Amsterdam. You can see it's got the NL there. The American version of that pill is more to his real life orange. This one is actually notorious for containing quite a lot of MDMA and being kind of dangerous because of the high dose in it. So MDMA is just like amphetamine, but it's more serotonergic and less noradrenergic. So you get that emotional connectedness, people get arousal, muscular tension, jaw clenching, and bruxism, or grinding of the teeth. This is the rave community's response to the bruxism problem. Put a pacifier in your mouth so you don't grind your teeth. And you can see everything with MDMA that you can see with amphetamine, but you can also see issues with hyponatremia. And it's not just that people are drinking a lot of water and they're in a hot club, sweating, dancing, and losing salt in water, but there's also an element of SIADH, and I'm going to show you some data for that in a moment. Also, like a lot of serotonergic drugs, it can lead to serotonin syndrome. So this is a study looking at pre and post clubbing urine sodium and in patients that are MDMA positive and MDMA negative. And the MDMA negative are the open squares, and you can see that the urine sodium doesn't really change that much, but the urine sodium goes down in people that are MDMA positive, so they're making more dilute urine. And this is a study in human volunteers given doses of MDMA or placebo, and you can see that their ABP levels in the patients that are given MDMA rise and then fall along with the MDMA concentrations, whereas the patients given placebo, that does not happen. You can also see permanent deficits in serotonergic function and deficits in cognitive function on certain types of cognitive testing using cannabis users as a control, because it's hard to find MDMA users that don't also use cannabis. And this is even with people who occasional recreational use, so maybe 1 or 2 weekends a month, potentially can affect cognitive function. This is a study looking at serotonergic neurons. This is a monkey, and you have an immunofluorescent stain for serotonin, and this is control monkey. This is post-MDMA use, and this is 7 years post-MDMA use, obviously a different monkey. And you can see it doesn't quite go back to the control level of serotonergic function. So next, amphetamine analog, I'll talk about Bromo Dragonfly. Not because this one is particularly important. There's a million different amphetamine analogs out there. I think this one's just really cool because it's named after the chemical structure, and I'm a nerd. So you can see it's got the bromine group on here. It kind of looks like a dragonfly, but you can see in there's the ring carbon-carbon nitrogen that's going to make it like an amphetamine. This one is kind of notorious for horrible ischemic complications in extremities. This is one patient and their ultimate outcome after using Bromo Dragonfly. Another amphetamine analog out there is N-bomb, and this is one that's notable for being extremely potent. So most amphetamine analogs people will take in milligram doses, right? The Trump one that has a lot of MDMA in it has like, I think, 240 milligrams of MDMA. This one is really potent and tends to be dosed in micrograms. So you start to see some effects with 50 to 100 micrograms. A typical dose might be 300 to 700, or a large dose would be 1,000 micrograms. And so it can be sold on the blotter paper, right? So a liquid of the substance we put on some colorful paper and might be confused for LSD. And interestingly, I talked about like a large dose might be up to 1,000 micrograms. Doses as low as 4 milligrams have been reported to cause death of this. So it doesn't take that much more than a dose that someone might take recreationally to make someone potentially get into trouble. And seizures, hyperthermia, and this has been a growing problem over the last 5 years or so. Another group of amphetamine analogs, and this is a large one, this tends to be one that's been a big issue in Europe especially, but here as well, the bath salts or cathinones. And so if you just look at amphetamine and methamphetamine here, and cathinone and metcathinone, this ketone group is really the only difference between them, but otherwise they're almost the same, and their clinical effects are going to be the same. Right? Still ring carbon-carbon nitrogen. Other cathinones, methadone, methylone, MDPV, MPPV, or other ones that have been around. All of these cathinones are derivatives of cathinone itself, and cathinone is a plant-derived product, and this is in the Catha edulis plants. It's used in the Middle East. If you've heard the term khat. Has anybody seen the movie Captain Phillips? One of the demands of the Somali pirates is khat, and it's a cathinone-containing plant. So people are looking for amphetamine-like effects. Metcathinone is one in the US that gained some popularity in the Michigan area. So all of these are basically going to be amphetamine-like in their clinical effects. A lot of different chemicals are sold as bath salts. Does anyone know why they're called bath salts? I heard someone kind of murmuring it from the back. Yeah, so it doesn't make them legal to sell, but it is an attempt to try to escape regulation. right? So they'll put on it not for human consumption. And the idea is, oh, this isn't something you're supposed to put in your body. This is something you put in the bath water, right? Wink, wink. And so, at the same time that Charlie Sheen is on the package, clearly trying to tell you that that's not what it's for. So this is one of a kind of recurring theme of a lot of these products is that they'll get sold that way. And we'll see the same thing when we start to look at the synthetic cannabinoids and how those are sold as not for human consumption to try to get around the Controlled Substance Enforcement Act of 1986 and to try to delay legislation that will make these products illegal. You remember these guys? Yeah, Face Eater and Face ED. Right, and this was widely publicized at the time, right, that this guy had taken bath salts and then attacked this guy. And it turned out actually after the fact that they didn't detect any cathinones in his system and it was only cannabis. So it's just a reminder that even things that we think of as being kind of benign can be triggers for psychosis in susceptible individuals. This was the eventual outcome of that guy's phase. Okay, next we can talk about some opioids as novel psychoactive substances. And just remember that we use the word opioid and not opiate because the opiates are morphine and codeine derivatives of the opium poppy. Our synthetics are heroin and semi-synthetics are basically have small structural modifications to morphine and codeine. The pure synthetics, which are most of the ones that we're going to be talking about, pyridine, epoxyphene, fentanyl, and fentanyl derivatives, and methadone. And remember that the synthetics are unlike morphine and codeine enough that they don't tend to show up on your intox screens unless you test for them specifically, whereas most of these are close enough that they'll be picked up. Also remember the various types of opioid receptors. The effects that people are looking for when they're using one of these substances recreationally is the mu1 effect. The mu2 effect is what mediates both the dependence and respiratory depression, which is the most important adverse effect. Kappa is what mediates meiosis, and some of the synthetics don't reliably cause meiosis. So Salvia is an interesting opioid because it's the only one that's a pure kappa agonist. We don't really have any that we use clinically. This is Maria Sabina, and she's a Mazatec shaman from southern Mexico, and she's a proponent of a variety of plant and fungal-derived psychogenic substances for spiritual purposes, and so she's been an advocate of psilocybin mushrooms, of maureen, glory seeds, and also of salvia. And salvia is basically a sedative. It doesn't have that respiratory depression that you'll typically see with other opioids, but it is pretty rapidly causes sedation. And there's a lot of YouTube videos that you can look out for on there. I particularly recommend the video Gardening on Salvia. Pretty entertaining. You can watch that when you get home. But a lot of people are using it for less spiritual purposes and just basically recreationally. Miley Cyrus was caught using it. So salvia is a derivative of the Salvia divinorum plant, which is also known as the diviner sage. It's a member of the mint family, and the active component is salvinorin A. It's basically a hallucinogen with disphoric properties, and the legal status is really in flux. There are some states that have tried to regulate it, but it's not scheduled by the DEA at this time. And it's sold widely online, either in the plant form or more commonly as extracts of the plant. And they'll have the potency of the extract. So 200x would be the concentration, how many times it's been concentrated. Another plant-derived opioid that's starting to be more and more available as the supply of prescription opioids has been drying up with increased control. The chronic pain community has turned to other places where they can get what they feel is adequate control of their pain that we as physicians may not be recognizing. And so kratom is one thing that a lot of people have turned to. It's a derivative of the Mitragyna speciosa tree, which grows in Southeast Asia and Southern Asia, in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. And it contains the active ingredients mitragynine, mitraphyline, and 7-hydroxymitragynine. These are mu agonists, so basically an opioid, right? But there are also some yohimbine-like effects. Does anybody know what those are? What yohimbine does? Yohimbine is kind of like anti-clonidine. So it's an alpha antagonist in the central circulation, so blocks negative feedback and increases sympathetic outflow, kind of that opposite of what clonidine does. So in low doses, it'll have some mild stimulant-like effects from the sympathetic effect. In higher doses, then you start to see some opioid-like effects. And this is another one that the DEA keeps talking about scheduling it and then has been backing off because of political pressure from some of these groups. And so it's currently not scheduled by the DEA. So we all know about the fentanyl problem. Fentanyl has really started to take off in recent years. So I think a lot of it started as the prescription opioids were becoming widely available. People had problems with prescription opioids, and then ultimately started turning to heroin as that supply started to dry up. But in recent years, other synthetics, fentanyls and their derivatives, have been taking over a lot of what used to be the heroin trade. And if you look at opioid deaths in New York City, this is data from NIDA looking at opioid deaths in New York City. The synthetics actually exceed heroin for the last few years, and these all tend to be fentanyl derivatives. So a lot of times these days it actually just gets sold as fentanyl, but sometimes it gets substituted for heroin and sold as heroin, or it might be substituted for other opioids. So this is fentanyl pills that are sold as OxyContin. So tablets that are meant to be taken orally, that are supposed to be sustained release. Someone might just get a large dose of fentanyl and be responsible for opioid deaths that way. And this has been a problem all over the place. Even more concerning, it may be substituted for things that aren't opioids at all. And so this is a fake Xanax tablet that was circulating a couple of years ago. So Xanax, alprazolam, benzodiazepine, instead being substituted with fentanyl and potentially going to somebody who has no opioid tolerance. And obviously that's a setup for an overdose. This is an article from the Times, even from 3 years ago, looking at fentanyl as now outpacing deaths from heroin in New York City. And it's not just fentanyl, it's other fentanyl derivatives. So fentanyl, does anyone know why fentanyl has become so popular as opposed to heroin if you're going to turn to an illegal opioid? Right, a lot of it's coming from China. It's being synthesized there and brought here. So why don't they just ship us heroin? Okay.
Sorry, you're asking why it's popular among the population, or why it's popular to send it over here?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's popular among the population because it's what's available. Why is it the one that's become so available? Why is it cheap? It's because of the potency, right? If you're going to smuggle a kilogram of something across the border, a kilogram of fentanyl is a lot more doses than a kilogram of heroin. And when we start to get to some of the other fentanyl derivatives, like carfentanil is hundreds of times more potent than fentanyl, and sufentanil is another extremely potent version that's much more potent than fentanyl. So if you look at the volume that you need to smuggle somewhere, you can get a lot more of it across the border with less chance of being intercepted, and get a lot more doses to sell. And if you want to try to make it safe, you can cut it with other things to make it a similar volume that the person is ultimately sold, but it takes very little drug to actually do that. And that also makes it dangerous because when people are cutting a product, it may not be uniform, the distribution of the drug within that powder that the person gets. Yeah?
A lot of people are dying from fentanyl here too because it's being cut inadvertently. So people are taking it in their crack, people are taking it in their weed, and they don't know that it's being cut in the weed.
It's been an adulterant on a whole bunch of different things. It's in the cocaine supply as well in some cases, although it's far from the most common adulterant in cocaine. But it's mostly sold as an opioid, and at this point, a lot of it is just sold as fentanyl, and people may be actively looking for it because some people prefer it. But what's actually driving it is not customer preference, it's the fact that it's easy to smuggle. This is an article from yesterday's Wall Street Journal looking at this problem, and one of the issues is that some of the fentanyl derivatives have been scheduled and are illegal. So carfentanil, sufentanil, fentanyl itself is a controlled substance. But there are so many more out there: acetylfentanyl, furanylfentanyl, and it's a growing problem because they're not even scheduled and they're not illegal to have or to traffic or to sell. And this is a quote from that article, just yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Special Narcotics Prosecutor Bridget Brennan said at a news conference at NYPD headquarters on Tuesday that 14 different fentanyl analogs have been identified in hundreds of overdose deaths in New York City since 2017, and only 2 of those analogs are currently prohibited under state law. Yeah.
Why is the designer drug law not?
So the designer drug law can be applied to this, but the DEA has to take that action to schedule them, and they haven't yet for all of these other fentanyl analogs. Also, the Designer Drug Act is a federal act, so this is talking about state law specifically. Okay, next we can talk about the synthetic cannabinoids. John W. Huffman is kind of the grandfather of the synthetic cannabinoids. He is not someone who was developing substances for people to use. He is a pharmacologist, and he developed the JWH series after his initials, John W. Huffman, of compounds that were designed to study cannabinoid receptors. Right, so this is delta-9 THC, that active ingredient in marijuana. This is JWH 133. It's one of the early synthetics in the JWH series. And so he developed a whole array of compounds to study cannabinoid receptors, and someone got the idea as, hey, why don't we spray some of these chemicals on some plants and make it look like something that sort of looks like marijuana that you can smoke and get high. And so there's no data on a lot of these substances in human populations. They were all developed for in vitro use for studying receptors, so people are literally experimenting on themselves. And so products like spice and K2 are synthetic cannabinoids, and they're sold as spice, and they're basically sold as air fresheners or as incense, and not for human consumption for the same reason that the bath salts were, to try to elude regulation. And limited clinical experience with the effects, and somewhat kind of contradictory effects, right? So you sometimes can see somebody with agitated delirium, and things that we expect to see with agitated delirium, like ischemic complications, and then some patients come in with deep sedation. And it's not clear if it's a dose-response effect or if it's just different cannabinoids that are sold that are on these products, and someone doesn't know what they're getting, right? So it's not like, that if you're buying a bottle of acetaminophen and you know that there's X number of milligrams of acetaminophen in it, people buy, K2, and it'll have 3 different synthetic cannabinoids in it, and the DEA scheduled 3 of them, and 2 weeks later, the same product was back on the shelves, and it had 3 new synthetic cannabinoids in it. So it's a variety of things, and buying the same product every time doesn't necessarily guarantee that people are getting the same substance. So it's a whole bunch of different drugs that get sold as the same thing, is probably why we see such a variety of clinical effects. This is one that we had here at Kings County. I think Dr. Schechter had this case. WTF, that should make you think maybe you shouldn't put that in your body. Fidel Castro on the toilet. This patient wound up having an ischemic stroke. And we were able to get samples of the product and from that patient and get it analyzed by a lab in Arkansas by coordinating with the Poison Center, and they found it contained a synthetic cannabinoid called XLR11, which at that time was legal, has since been scheduled by the DEA. There's a huge slew of these things. It's not just the JWH series anymore. You probably can't see all of these from the back. But this is just a list of some of the things that have been seized in recent shipments of synthetic cannabinoids. And we see the JWH ones, we see XLR11 up there, but we see other things like abfubinaca and chiminaka and pinaka and a whole bunch of other things that don't really sound like drugs. So at one point, a lot of these substances were being sold in the Cannons Express deli across the street, and so a lot of our patients were getting them there. And there's been a pretty reasonably effective crackdown on that type of commercial sale. So I think it's at least driven it underground, and it's not just being openly sold at a deli at this point. I think another thing that's contributed to us not seeing it quite as much as before, I think is this video, honestly. I'm not going to show the whole video, you can find it online, but does anybody remember this, the zombies from a couple summers ago? There was one street in Bed-Stuy where there were just a whole bunch of people just kind of passed out or walking practically unconscious on the street after using this substance. And I think we saw a big downturn right after that. Because there was a period a couple of years ago that you couldn't work a shift without seeing a handful of these patients. And now you still see them, but not nearly as commonly as we did before. Okay, so to sum up, amphetamine analogs are indirect norepi, serotonin, and dopamine agonists. Remember, if it has that ring carbon-carbon nitrogen in the structure somewhere, it's probably going to have some amphetamine-like effects. Things get sold as not for human consumption to try to escape regulation. Fentanyl and derivatives are increasingly available, and the reason they're available is because they're so potent, they're easy to smuggle. Heroin can be adulterated with fentanyl, or it can mimic oxycodone, Xanax, or pretty much anything else. Synthetic cannabinoids were originally research chemicals that were designed for studying cannabinoid receptors, and their clinical effects can be really hard to predict, and they don't really look like marijuana intoxication. Any questions? This is my cat with my fresh 11th edition Gold Frank's Toxicologic Emergencies. She's already been cracking the books. All right, thank you.